Hi again, students. I'm Favor Olarewaju and welcome back to Economics Simplified with Favor. If you're new here, I'm the instructor for this Introduction to Microeconomics class, and we're all about breaking down complex economic topics into simple concepts and calculations that the average person can understand and relate to day-to-day examples. I'm using the textbook Principles of Microeconomics by Gregory Mankiw, either the 9th or the 10th edition. So I have gotten a lot of good feedback from various students who have found this set of videos useful, and that makes me happy. So if you are among those students that find these videos useful, don't forget to like, to subscribe, so that you get timely updates of when new videos are posted, and also feel free to share these videos to other students who are taking economics classes that might find it useful. And quickly, let's move on to today's topic. Today we're going to be covering chapter 16, which is on monopoly. So monopoly is basically when there is only one seller and producer without any close substitute of a good and service. And there are different types of monopoly. The first type is a pure monopoly, which is simply when a particular firm has the only access to the resources such as water, electricity, diamonds, gold, oil, and the likes. And so because it has sole access to these resources, no other company can compete with it or come into the market with it. However, this kind of firm in real life is rare, because what are the odds that one company has access to resources that no other company has an access to, right? So what is more common is the second type of monopoly, which is a government-created or a government-regulated monopoly. And in this case, it's most likely that the country has access to natural resources, right? Then what the government does is to take over, either by monopolizing that good and service, being the sole producer and distributor of it, or it gives exclusive access to a particular firm to control, manage, and distribute these resources. It usually gives patents. So patents is a form of protection which prevents any other company from producing or creating the same thing, so that the monopoly is able to recoup the high cost of investments. In Memphis, a very good example will be the MLGW, which is where we pay our utility bills to, right? Another very good example of a monopolist is pharmaceutical products, right? So it's very hard to come up with the technology and the medicines that are able to cure various ailments. So for the first few years when a company launches a medication, no one else can produce that medication. So that allows time for that company to regain all the huge investment it has spent on producing that medicine, right? So it's going to take, let's say, 5-10 years before another company can come and produce a similar generic drugs that reduce the cost of production and the entry costs. The third type of monopoly is a natural monopoly. A natural monopoly simply has to do with when a firm is able to reduce on production costs because it has such bulk production. And an example of this could be club goods like internet access, cable TV subscription, satellite radio, internet downloads, and the likes. So for example, if two firms are to supply electricity to 500 homes each, then they would each have a higher cost of production compared to if only one firm was to supply electricity to all the homes in the city. Then there would be accumulated reduced cost of production, which is where economies of scale comes in, such that you would have your average total cost sloping downwards like this. So for instance, in the latter example, when you have only one firm supplying electricity, then they're able to save up on costs, so that, for instance, each home is able to pay $50 thereabouts per month for electricity, right? So assuming that they're supplying to about 1,000 homes, as opposed to a higher cost of production for supplying to less number of homes. So let's say $90. So in that way, a monopoly is able to save on huge fixed costs and small marginal costs. So that brings us to what are the characteristics of a monopoly. So as I already mentioned, a monopoly is one seller, and this one seller does not have a close substitute. So that is the reason why they are able to be the only firm in the market. And also it has market power. So it controls the entire market. And imagine being able to call the shots in the market. Then what does that mean for price? It simply means that they are price makers, right? So they do not take a market price. So they can wake up one morning and decide to change the prices of goods and services, and we don't have a choice but to continue buying. It can also control the quantity, but not at the same time. So for instance, a monopoly can decide to increase the price or reduce the quantity. So if they're increasing the price, then they're able to make excess profit, and at the same time they could leave the price at a low level but reduce the quantity. So reducing the quantity will create a shortage, which will still enable them to make excess profits. What this means is that because it has such great market power, then it deters others from entering the market, right? So it creates barrier to entry. So there's no free entry and exit here. So remember, a perfect competition has your price equal to marginal revenue and equal to demand. So there are price takers with many buyers and sellers. So you see the demand curve is straight, it's a horizontal line. However, for a monopoly, the demand curve slopes downward. and it has no supply curve. So remember again, for your perfect competition, your marginal cost curve is equal to your supply curve. So let's quickly take an example so it makes more sense. Assuming we have quantity and we have price, let's find the total revenue, the average revenue, and the marginal revenue. So now remember, your total revenue is price times quantity. So at 0 units, whatever the price is still going to be 0 revenue, right? Because 0 units are produced. At 1 unit, you have 1 unit times $55, which is $55. At this second point, you have 2 times $50, which is $100. And you keep on going up till you get to the last point, which is 10 units times $10, which gives us $100. How about your average revenue? Your average revenue is your total revenue divided by your quantity. So 0 divided by 0, I mean, there's nothing here. At the first quantity, 55 divided by 1, that gives you $55. At the second quantity, $100 divided by 2, that gives you $50. And the third quantity, 135 divided by 3, that gives you $45. So pretty much notice how the amount you're getting for your average revenue is exactly equal to the amount you're getting for your price at every quantity. How about your marginal revenue? Your marginal revenue is the change in your total revenue as a result of the change in quantity. So at this first point, 55 minus 0 units is going to give us $55, divided by the change in quantity, 1 minus 0, which is going to give you divided by 1, which is still going to give you $55. Same thing here, 100 minus 55, that gives you $45. $45 divided by 2 minus 1, that's going to give you still 1, so $45. And you keep on doing this up till the end, where you get minus $35. So you see that after the quantity of 6 units, then the additional revenue you are getting as a result of producing an extra unit of a good, it becomes negative. So you begin to have extra negative revenue, which is not a good thing. Okay. However, remember that your optimal profit maximizing quantity in the short run is where your marginal revenue is equal to your marginal costs. So now let's try to plot our demand and marginal revenue curve for the monopolist. So your quantity is on this axis, your price is on this axis. At 0 units produced, you have $60 as the price, right? So it's going to start all the way from up here, $60. At 1 unit, you have $55. At 2 units, you have $50. At 3 units, you have $45 price. At 4 units, you have $40 price. At 5 units, you have $35 price. At 6 units, you have $30 price. At 7 units, you got $25 price. At 8 units, you got $20 price. At 9 units, you got $15 price. At 10 units, you got $10 price. So you see that your demand curve is going to come like this, and this is going to be your demand curve. How about your marginal revenue curve? So it starts up from $55 here at 1 unit, and then it continues to $45 at 2 units, and then $35 at 3 units. Remember, you're tracing it all the way like this, and then $35. And $25 at 4 units, and $15 at 5 units, $5 at 6 units, minus $5 at 7 units, minus $15 at 8 units, minus $25 at 9 units, which is going to be down here, and minus $35 at 10 units. So it's going to go all the way down here. So your marginal revenue curve, you see that it slopes at a lower level downward below your demand curve. So your marginal revenue curve is less than price after Q equal to 1. So you see that at Q equal to 1, it's at the same level of $55, but after that, your marginal revenue is at a lower level compared to your demand curve. If your marginal revenue is less than your price, then that means your price is greater than your marginal revenue, and that just goes in line with the monopolist goal of making excess profits. So in line with your optimal profit maximizing condition for the short run, so if you have your marginal cost curve sloping upward and intersecting your curve, so this is your marginal cost curve, and it intersects your marginal revenue curve at this point. So therefore, if you trace this point to your price axis, then that would be $15. However, the monopolist is not going to charge such a low price, right? So the monopolist is going to take this intersection point and go all the way up to your demand curve, then trace it from your demand curve to the price axis. And that is going to give you somewhere around $40. So you see that instead of monopoly charging $15 as in a perfect competition, where you would have this kind of straight line, your perfect competition price or your monopolistic competition price. So monopolistic competition, again, remember, is when you have many buyers and sellers, but they are not selling the exact identical goods. They are selling similar identical goods that are differentiated in terms of branding, right? So in that case, the price in the perfect competition or monopolistic competition will be $15, but you see that a monopolist charges the highest price possible. So the monopolist is always going to charge based on a buyer's willingness to pay. So if you're willing to pay as high as $100 for your product, that is the price a monopolist is going to charge you. However, a monopolist is never going to know the exact willingness to pay of a buyer, because as buyers, we will never reveal our highest willingness to pay to a seller, because I mean, that's counterintuitive. So even though you're willing to pay in your head as high as $100, when you go to a seller, you will try to negotiate it down, right? So that is the reason why the monopolist cannot really charge the highest willingness to pay price of a consumer, but they're still going to charge the highest price possible, which in this case, you see that at the intersection point of marginal cost and marginal revenue, when they take it all the way up to the highest possible possible point, they go as high as $40, right, to charge for the price. How about your average total cost curve? So remember that as long as the firm is able to cover the average total cost curve, then they are good to remain in business, okay? So imagine your average total cost curve intersects here. Then this point below the minimum line of your average total cost curve is going to mark your profit level. Anywhere from $40 to $30 is going to be the excess profit that is charged by the monopoly, this shaded area, okay? But now, do you realize how there is an extra triangle here? I'm going to try and shade it differently, but I hope you can see the differentiation. So this triangle is what we call a deadweight loss. So meaning that the monopolist is charging such a high price that the consumers lose their consumer surplus, and it's literally only the producer surplus that is left, right? So it's at the disadvantage of the consumers that it causes inefficiency. Because the price is way too high, the monopolists will want to reduce the quantity sold as much as possible. So they could be selling as much as 7-8 units, but they will choose to sell 5 or less units at the highest price possible, which is $40. So as a result, they are selling a less than efficient quantity in the market just to be able to make the most out of their profits. So again, remember, when your price is greater than your average total cost, remember this is your average total cost here at $25, right, the shaded part. So any price above this line means that the monopoly is making excess profits, right? And any price below this line, that's a loss, because then they will not be able to cover their average total cost curve. So therefore, price minus average total cost times quantity is going to give you monopoly profits. So again, remember that a monopolist doesn't have a supply curve. So this marginal cost curve that you saw sloping upwards is not the supply curve, because the monopoly determines what quantity they're willing to sell and also determines the price that they're willing to set. Okay, so although they're not controlling it at the same time, so now we know that the monopolist is willing to charge as high as $40 and produce as high as 5 units of the good and service. But when the monopoly patent expires, then you have other firms being able to enter the market at a lower cost, right? And then that leads to what we call monopolistic competition, when you have more sellers and more buyers. And then because of that, the price reduces to this straight line. Remember the straight line we had here in the perfect competition? So the price reduces to here, the initial intersection point of your marginal revenue and marginal cost. That straight line now becomes your monopolistic competition price, or your perfect competition price of $15. And if you drag your $15 all the way, the quantity can be as high as 9 units being sold. Okay, now let's talk about price discrimination. What is price discrimination? That is something where a monopolist is still trying to make excess profits, but rather than charging just one high price, then they charge different prices to different sets of customers, right? So, but basically there are different types of price discrimination. The first type is perfect price discrimination. So in a perfect price discrimination, the price that a monopoly charges to each buyer is different. But in that situation, it's kind of difficult to navigate in reality, because buyer A is going to talk to buyer B and be like, hey, why are our prices different, you know? But the reason the monopolist is able to charge different prices to different consumers is based on their willingness to pay, is based on your income capacity. So if the monopolist knows that, for instance, Elon Musk comes to buy, utility bills or diamond or whatever natural resource from the firm, then they're going to charge Elon Musk a much higher price because they know he's willing to pay, as opposed to like an average low income earner or a middle income earner. So what is more realistic than a perfect price discrimination, because buyers are going to talk amongst themselves, and to prevent any form of backlash, is they need to provide a justifiable reason for charging different prices to different customers other than their willingness to pay. Let's talk about airplane tickets, right? That's why you have the first class, you have the economy, you have the business class and all of that. And then what they tell you is that the services you get for each of these different categories is different, right? So if you want premium treatment, the most relaxing flights ever, comfortable chairs, all of that, then you should go for a first class, as opposed to going for an economy class, right? Same thing with train. Those who go by train, there's the option for coach and there's the option for the premium treatment as well. Because if they just charged only one price, then because people don't have a close-up student, they'll probably buy the barest minimum of quantity, right? But now that monopolist has different prices for different groups of customers, then people are able to buy more quantity based on their willingness to pay. Okay, so now let's take an example. So let's assume this movie theater, they have two options. They could either sell a movie ticket at $5 to as many as 2,500 people, as opposed to selling the movie tickets at $18. The highest price that the monopolist wants to charge is 1,000 people. So let's calculate what the profit level is for these two different levels. At the first level, your total revenue is going to be $5 times 2,500, which is 12,500. Regardless of the price they charged, they are going to incur the high fixed cost already. It's $10,000. So 12,500 minus $10,000, that's going to give you $2,500. That's not a lot of profit, and the monopoly is trying to make as much profit as possible. How about $18? So total revenue, $18 times 1,000 is going to give you $18,000 minus $10,000. That's going to give you $8,000 as profit. So it's a tough choice. You don't want to make $8,000 profit, or do they want to make $2,500 profits? But with price discrimination, they can even make more than these two options combined. You may ask how. They can give discounts to different groups of people, so like children, seniors and elderly people that are above 65 years old, veterans who have served in the military. They could even do like weekday sales or weekend sales. They could also do quantity sales, so like for instance at the movie theater you could get like a small size of popcorn for $7, but if you get a big size of popcorn which is double the size, you only get to pay $10, right? So that's just $3 extra but for double the quantity. So now let's assume that the original price of the movie ticket is $18 and then they decide to do the discounts of $5 for seniors, veterans, children and the likes. Then they're going to sell the $18 to the 1,000 people. And then they're going to sell those remaining tickets at $5 to these other categories of people with less willingness to pay. So $5 times, so remember the highest quantity they can sell is 2,500. So 2,500 tickets minus 1,000 tickets. So in that way, they're able to sell $5 for the remaining 1,500 tickets. So that's going to lead to a total profit of 18,000 plus $5 times 1,500, $7,500 extra, and by the time you add it up, that's going to give you 25,500 minus your $10,000 total costs, and that's going to give you a total profit of 15,500. So can you see that with price discrimination, the profits that the monopolist is able to earn is way more than if it only charges one low price or one high price. So price discrimination is a win-win for everybody. So what public policies can the government do to discourage monopolists from being extreme in their profits surplus? One option is for the government to discourage horizontal mergers. So horizontal mergers means preventing companies in the same line of business from merging together, because it would be a disadvantage to the consumers since they will be getting less than efficient quantity and exorbitant prices. An example of that is, imagine if Pepsi and Coca-Cola merge into one brand. Then consumers no longer have a substitute to go to, and it creates deadweight loss and inefficiency in the market. Another thing that the government can do is to mandate that the price must be set at the minimum average total cost. So instead of having excess profits now, the firms just have enough to cover their average total cost. So it leads to zero profit, and that could be a bad thing because it's going to discourage economies of scale, and then it's going to lead to firms exiting the market. The last option that the government can do is to actually take over the monopoly, right? But if the government does that, then it's most likely going to become inefficient because the government is not going to have as much incentive to look for creative ways to bring down the total cost of production, right? And it's going to be a disadvantage to the consumers because we are at total mercy of the government. All our taxpayers' money, everything is going to the government. If the price effect exceeds the output effect, that means the high price that is being charged is way more than the lowest quantity that is being supplied. Then that leads to an inefficient point where your marginal revenue becomes negative, right? So remember the previous example we took, at the point after 6 units of goods sold, then you see that your marginal revenue becomes negative. And that is that for chapter 16. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you found it very insightful and you've understood how monopoly works in terms of finding the monopoly price and the output versus the monopolistic competitive price and output, and even how price discrimination works and being able to apply it to everyday life. So again, don't forget to like, to share and to subscribe, because your support goes a long way in keeping this channel open for other economic students that would find this useful. Thank you, and see you in the next chapter.